I'm not letting some black girl destroy my life. Marcus Crawford's words exploded through the Chicago Public Defender's conference room before his open hand cracked across Wynne Chambers' face. The Harvard-trained lawyer stumbled backward, her cheek stinging red from the racist assault. Security guards rushed in, slamming Marcus against the wall in handcuffs. Another hate crime, another destroyed case. But then something extraordinary happened. Her face still burning from the slap, Wynne calmly reached for her briefcase. When she looked up at the now panicking Marcus, there was something devastating in her professional gaze that made his racial hatred freeze into pure terror. "I have the digital evidence that proves your complete innocence," she said, voice steady despite the assault. Calm, controlled, absolutely devastating. Silence fell over the room. Marcus's eyes went wide with horrified realization, because he had just violently attacked the only person who could save his life. What happened next would expose the most shocking irony in legal history. Long shadows through the windows of the Cook County Public Defender's office as Wynne Chambers arrived at 7:30 a.m. sharp. At 29, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every step of her journey. From Harvard Law Review to the trenches of Chicago's most challenging legal battles. Her corner office, though modest, told the story of her dedication. Law books lined every shelf, case files stacked with meticulous organization. On the wall hung her Harvard Law diploma, but beside it was something more meaningful, a framed letter from a client's mother. "Thank you for seeing my son's humanity when no one else would." Wynne had built her reputation on impossible cases. While other public defenders managed overwhelming caseloads with plea bargains, she dove deep into evidence, spending her own money on investigators when the state wouldn't fund them. Her success rate with acquittals was legendary in the courthouse halls. This morning, she faced her newest challenge, Marcus Crawford, a 35-year-old construction foreman charged with first-degree murder. The case seemed hopeless. Circumstantial evidence placed him at the scene, no alibi, and 2 previous public defenders had already recommended plea deals. But Wynne had learned something crucial. The cases that looked most hopeless often hid the most shocking truths. She spread Marcus's file across her desk, studying crime scene photos and witness statements with laser focus. Something felt wrong about the timeline, inconsistencies that others had dismissed as minor details. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. "Crawford meeting at 2 p.m. Room 4. Good luck, you'll need it." Wynne had no idea how prophetic those words would be, but what she was about to discover would test everything she believed about justice. 3 floors below Wynne's office, Marcus Crawford sat in the county jail's holding cell, staring at concrete walls that had become his world for the past 3 months. His calloused hands, once steady enough to guide construction cranes, now shook with the constant anxiety of a man watching his life disappear. The evidence against him was damning. Security footage showed him near the warehouse, where businessman Robert Sterling had been found shot execution style. Marcus's fingerprints were on a beer bottle found 50 yards from the body. 3 witnesses placed his distinctive red pickup truck in the area around the time of death, but Marcus knew something the prosecutors didn't. He was innocent. The night of the murder, he'd been drinking at Murphy's Tavern, drowning his sorrows after losing his construction job. He'd left the bar around 11 p.m., driven toward home, and made a crucial mistake, stopping to urinate behind the warehouse. That's how his prints got on the bottle, how witnesses saw his truck. But who would believe an unemployed alcoholic with a criminal record over forensic evidence? His first public defender, an overworked 20-something fresh from law school, had barely looked at the file. "Take the plea, Marcus. 25 to life beats the death penalty." The second defender had been more experienced, but equally defeatist. "The evidence is overwhelming. We're looking at damage control." Now they were sending him a third lawyer, probably another burnout who saw him as just another case number. Meanwhile, Wynne was uncovering something extraordinary. She'd spent the entire night reviewing security footage from surrounding businesses, frame by frame. Most lawyers would have accepted the prosecution's edited compilation, but Wynne always went to the source. That's when she found it, a timestamp discrepancy. The warehouse footage showed Marcus's truck at 11:47 p.m., but the auto shop across the street recorded the same truck passing at 11:23 p.m., 24 minutes earlier. Either Marcus had driven in circles for nearly half an hour, or someone had digitally altered the evidence. The discovery sent chills down her spine. If the timestamp was wrong, everything else might be fabricated. The evidence seemed impossible to overcome, but Wynne had found something no one else had seen. Room 4 of the Cook County Public Defender's Office was designed for difficult conversations. Windowless, cramped, with a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 uncomfortable chairs. The only decoration was a security camera in the corner and a panic button near the door. At 2:00 p.m. precisely, Officer Dean Warren escorted Marcus Crawford into the room. The defendant's first glimpse of his new lawyer stopped him cold. Wynne Chambers looked impossibly young, impossibly polished, and impossibly black. Marcus had been expecting another middle-aged white man in a rumpled suit, someone who looked like he belonged in the system. Instead, he saw a petite black woman in an expensive blazer, her natural hair styled in a professional cut, briefcase organized with military precision. His face hardened immediately. After 3 months of disappointment, his desperation had curdled into cynicism and something uglier, racial resentment fed by prison conversations and a lifetime of barely suppressed prejudice. "You're kidding me," Marcus muttered as Officer Warren uncuffed him. "They sent me a kid." Wynne extended her hand professionally. "Mr. Crawford, I'm Wynne Chambers. I'll be representing you going forward." Marcus ignored her outstretched hand, slumping into the metal chair. "How long you been doing this? 6 months? Let me guess. You're here to get some experience on the hopeless cases before moving to real law." "I've been with the Public Defender's Office for 3 years, Wynne replied calmly, taking her seat across from him. "I specialize in complex criminal cases, particularly those involving forensic evidence." "Forensic evidence?" Marcus's laugh was bitter. "Lady, I don't need a specialist. I need a miracle worker. The cops have me dead to rights." Wynne opened her briefcase and spread several photographs across the table, frame-by-frame captures from security cameras, each marked with precise timestamps. "Actually, Mr. Crawford, that's where you're wrong. The evidence against you has been systematically falsified." For the first time since entering the room, Marcus looked directly at her. Something in her voice, the absolute certainty, the professional competence, cut through his defensive anger. "What are you talking about?" "The security footage placing you at the murder scene has been digitally altered. The timestamps don't match surrounding cameras. Someone wanted you to look guilty, and they did a sloppy job covering their tracks." Marcus stared at the photographs, seeing technical details that meant nothing to him, but recognizing something crucial in Wynne's presentation. She had actually done the work. Unlike his previous lawyers, she had looked beyond the surface. But 3 months of despair and a lifetime of prejudice don't disappear in an instant. "Right," he said, sarcasm creeping back into his voice. "And you figured this out when 2 other lawyers missed it? What makes you so special?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus didn't realize it yet, but he had just insulted the one person capable of saving his life. What Marcus didn't know was that Wynne had already uncovered the key to his freedom. The atmosphere in room 4 grew heavier as Wynne methodically laid out her findings. She had prepared for this moment carefully, knowing that gaining Marcus's trust would be crucial to mounting an effective defense. What she hadn't prepared for was the depth of his hostility. "The digital forensics are clear," she explained, pointing to a detailed chart showing timestamp inconsistencies. "Someone with advanced technical skills altered multiple video files, but they made critical errors. The metadata doesn't lie." Marcus barely glanced at her evidence. Instead, he was studying her, the expensive briefcase, the Harvard class ring, the confident way she spoke about technical details that sailed over his head. "Let me ask you something," he interrupted, leaning back in his chair with arms crossed. "How many clients like me you had? Blue-collar white guys facing murder charges?" The question caught Wynne off guard, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she recognized the trap being laid. "Mr. Crawford, I represent clients from all backgrounds. The law doesn't discriminate based on—" "Cut the politically correct bullshit." Marcus's voice was getting louder, and through the reinforced glass, Officer Warren turned toward the room with increased attention. I asked you a simple question. How many guys like me? Wynne maintained her professional composure, but inside she felt the familiar sting of having her competence questioned, not for the first time, and certainly not the last. My client demographics aren't relevant to your case. What matters is that I have evidence of your innocence. Evidence, Marcus repeated mockingly, some timestamp thing that probably means nothing. You know what I think? I think they gave me to you because they don't give a damn about my case. Another disposable white boy from the South Side gets the diversity hire lawyer. The words hit Wynne like a physical blow. She had heard variations of this accusation throughout her career, from opposing counsel, who assumed she was an affirmative action appointment, from judges who questioned her preparedness, from clients' families who requested real lawyers. But hearing it from someone she was literally trying to save cut deeper than usual. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice still controlled but with a steel edge that hadn't been there before, "I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School. I have successfully defended 43 clients charged with serious felonies. My acquittal rate is 68%, which is 4 times the office average. Your previous attorneys recommended plea bargains because they didn't have the skills or dedication to find the truth. I do." Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal. The stress of 3 months in jail, the fear of execution, and years of buried racial resentment were converging into something dangerous. Skills? Dedication? His voice rose to near shouting. "You think this is about qualifications. This is about understanding. You grew up in some fancy neighborhood, went to elite schools, probably never met anyone like me until you took this job. How are you going to understand what I'm going through?" Wynne stood as well, matching his intensity with cold professionalism. "I understand that you're innocent of murder. I understand that someone powerful enough to manipulate digital evidence wants you convicted. And I understand that you're about to throw away your only chance at freedom because you can't see past my skin color." The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Marcus stopped pacing, his face flushed with anger and something else, the dawning realization that his prejudice was showing. Officer Warren's hand moved to his radio, sensing the escalation through the glass. Marcus turned to face Wynne directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his desperation and rage. "Don't you dare make this about race. This is about you people in your ivory towers who don't know what it's like for regular folks. You'll take your swing at this case, pad your resume, then move on to the next charity project while I rot in prison." The accusation hung between them like a live wire. Wynne had faced discrimination her entire career, but this was different, more personal, more vicious. She could see in Marcus's eyes that he genuinely believed his own words, that 3 months of fear had twisted into something ugly and misdirected. What happened next would change both their lives forever, but neither could see it coming. The next 5 seconds would change everything forever. The tension in room 4 had been building for 20 minutes, fed by Marcus's desperation and prejudice, Wynne's professional frustration, and the claustrophobic atmosphere of the windowless conference room. What came next happened so fast that Officer Warren barely had time to react. "You people!" Marcus exploded, his 3 months of terror and rage finally finding a target. "You sit there with your fancy degrees and your technical evidence, pretending to care, but you don't know what it's like to be thrown away by the system." Wynne remained seated, her hands flat on the table, maintaining every ounce of professional dignity she could muster. "Mr. Crawford, I understand you're frightened, but attacking me won't—" "Don't tell me what I am." Marcus's voice cracked with desperation. "I'm looking at death row because some prosecutor wanted an easy conviction, and they give me you as my last hope? A diversity hire who probably sees me as just another racist white boy who deserves what he gets." The accusation was so unfair, so completely wrong, that for a moment Wynne was speechless. Here she was, holding evidence that could save his life, and he was attacking her for the crime of trying to help, while black. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I have worked 18 hours a day for 3 weeks on your case. I have found evidence that your previous attorneys missed because they didn't have the expertise or dedication to look deeper. I am the only person in this building who believes in your innocence, and you're attacking me because you're not one of us?" Marcus shouted, slamming his hand on the metal table. "You'll never understand what it's like to be abandoned by everyone who's supposed to protect you." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. A black woman who had faced systemic discrimination. Her entire career was being accused of not understanding abandonment by a white man whose prejudice was blinding him to his salvation. Wynne stood up slowly, her composure finally cracking. "Mr. Crawford, you want to know about being abandoned by the system, about having people assume you don't belong, about working twice as hard for half the recognition. Let me tell you." But Marcus was beyond listening. 3 months of fear, humiliation, and desperation erupted in a moment of pure, misdirected rage. "I don't want to hear your sob stories," he screamed, lunging forward across the small table. "You probably volunteered for this case just to prove some point about helping the poor white racist." His open hand moved faster than thought, faster than Officer Warren's reaction time, faster than Wynne's ability to dodge. The slap echoed through the room like a gunshot. Wynne stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek, which burned with the force of the blow. For a moment, the room was frozen in shocked silence, Marcus staring at his own hand in horror, Wynne's eyes wide with disbelief, Officer Warren's keyring jingling as he rushed toward the door. "Oh my God," Marcus whispered, the reality of what he'd done crashing over him like a wave. "Oh my God, I didn't mean—" The door burst open as Officer Warren and 2 additional guards flooded into the room. "Hands behind your back, now!" As they slammed Marcus against the wall and cuffed him, he kept looking back at Wynne with growing horror. The woman he had just assaulted was still holding her briefcase, still surrounded by the evidence that could save his life, evidence he had just violently rejected. "I'm sorry," he gasped, as the guards dragged him toward the door. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean—" But it was too late. In one moment of racist rage, Marcus Crawford had committed assault against his own attorney, adding a hate crime to his charges and seemingly destroying his only chance at freedom. As the handcuffs clicked, neither knew what Wynne had discovered just hours before. The aftermath of violence always brings a strange, hollow quiet. As Officer Warren escorted Marcus out of room 4, Wynne stood alone in the fluorescent-lit space, her cheek throbbing and her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. Her phone buzzed immediately. The security footage would have triggered automatic alerts to her supervisor, the court, and the district attorney's office. Within minutes, this incident would be documented, analyzed, and added to Marcus Crawford's growing list of charges. "Ms. Chambers," Officer Warren had returned, his face grim with concern. "EMTs are on their way to check you out. Do you want to press charges for the assault?" The question hung in the air. Wynne touched her cheek gingerly. It would bruise, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the professional humiliation. In her 3 years as a public defender, she had never been attacked by a client. The story would spread through the courthouse like wildfire, the Harvard-trained lawyer who got slapped by her own racist client. "Where is Mr. Crawford now?" she asked. "Solitary confinement. He'll be charged with assault on a legal representative, possibly elevated to a hate crime given the nature of his comments." Warren's discomfort with the racial aspect was obvious. "The DA's office is already talking about additional charges." Wynne nodded absently, her mind working through the legal implications. Marcus now faced first-degree murder, assault on an attorney, and potentially federal hate crime charges. Any plea deal possibilities had evaporated. His chances at a fair trial had dropped from slim to non-existent. And she was the only person who could prove his innocence. "Officer Warren," she said quietly, "I need to see Mr. Crawford's case file updated with today's incident, and I need to know who's taking over his defense." Warren looked confused. "Ma'am, you can't possibly continue representing him after—" "I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet," Wynne interrupted, her voice carrying a steel that made the veteran officer take a step back. "But I need those files." 20 minutes later, Wynne sat in her office with an ice pack pressed to her cheek, staring at her computer screen. The courthouse grapevine had already started spinning the story. Public defender attacked by racist client. Harvard lawyer assaulted in hate crime. Defense attorney slapped by white supremacist. Her phone rang constantly. Colleagues offering support, supervisors asking for statements, reporters who had somehow already heard the story. She ignored them all. Instead, she focused on the manila folder lying open on her desk. Inside were the timestamp analyses, the digital forensics reports, and the breakthrough discovery she had made at 3 a.m. that morning. Marcus Crawford had been framed by someone with serious technical skills and access to multiple security systems. The real killer was still free, probably celebrating Marcus's impending conviction. The racist assault had made Marcus the most unsympathetic defendant in Chicago, ensuring that no jury would look past his obvious guilt to see the planted evidence. Her supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Wynn, what the hell happened down there?" "My client lost control and assaulted me," Wynn replied simply. "Hi, your former client," Janet corrected. "I've already contacted the court to withdraw you from the case. Given the circumstances, no one will question—" "I'm not withdrawing," Janet's jaw dropped. "Wynn, you cannot be serious. The man committed a racially motivated assault against you. The optics alone. The optics are exactly why I need to stay on the case." Wynn set down the ice pack and looked directly at her supervisor. "Marcus Crawford is innocent of murder. I have evidence that proves it. If I withdraw now, he'll be convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and the real killer goes free. He attacked you. He made a terrible mistake driven by fear and prejudice, but that doesn't make him a murderer." Janet stared at her in disbelief. "Wynn, I've known you for 3 years. You're brilliant, dedicated, and professional. But this is insane. You cannot represent a man who just committed a hate crime against you." Wynn stood up slowly, wincing slightly as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her bruised cheek. "Janet, I became a public defender because I believe everyone deserves competent legal representation, regardless of their background or their mistakes. If I abandon Marcus now because of what he did, I'm no better than the system that failed him in the first place." "The system didn't fail him, Wynn. He failed himself when he decided to assault his attorney. The system failed him when they gave him 2 incompetent lawyers who missed obvious evidence of his innocence. It failed him when they threw him in jail for 3 months without adequate investigation. And it will fail him again if I let his racist stupidity blind me to the truth." Janet shook her head in frustration. "Even if you're right about the evidence, no jury will acquit him now, not after this." Wynn picked up the forensics report from her desk, holding it like a weapon. "Then I'll have to be good enough to make them see past their prejudice to the facts. Just like I'm asking myself to see past Marcus's prejudice to save his life." The silence stretched between them as Janet processed what she was hearing. "You're really going to do this," Janet said finally. "How you're going to represent the man who assaulted you?" "I'm going to represent an innocent man who made a terrible mistake," Wynn corrected, "because that's what justice looks like, even when it's ugly." As her supervisor left, shaking her head in dismay, Wynn returned to her computer and began typing a motion to the court. She would need to convince a judge to allow her to continue representing Marcus despite the assault. She would need to overcome the negative publicity, the whispers in the courthouse, and the certainty that she had lost her mind. But first, she needed to prove something that seemed impossible, that the man who had just attacked her was worth saving. The evidence in her briefcase would prove she was right. While Marcus Crawford sat in solitary confinement, replaying the moment his hand struck Wynn's face over and over in his mind, the lawyer he had assaulted was working through the night to save his life. Her office had become a forensics laboratory, with multiple computer screens displaying timestamp data, metadata analyses, and frame-by-frame video comparisons. The breakthrough had come at 2:47 a.m., 3 days before the assault, when Wynn finally cracked the digital manipulation that had framed Marcus. But the complexity of the evidence meant she needed more than just her own analysis. She needed an expert who could testify in court about the sophisticated nature of the fraud. As Dr. Sarah Kim, a digital forensics specialist at Northwestern University, had been skeptical when Wynn first contacted her. Timestamp manipulation at this level requires advanced skills and expensive software, Dr. Kim had explained during their initial phone call. "We're not talking about amateur hour." Now, as they sat together in Wynn's office at 1 a.m., 12 hours after the assault, Dr. Kim was reviewing the evidence with growing amazement. "This is extraordinary," she said, pointing to a series of hexadecimal codes displayed on Wynn's largest monitor. Someone didn't just alter the security footage. They created an entirely fabricated timeline and embedded it into multiple camera systems. The technical sophistication suggests this was done by someone with professional-grade equipment and extensive knowledge of surveillance networks. Wynn leaned forward, ignoring the throbbing in her bruised cheek. Professional enough to work for a security company, or law enforcement or military. We're talking about someone with access to tools that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Doctor. Kim pulled up another screen showing network architecture diagrams, but here's what's really interesting. They made one crucial mistake. On the screen was a timeline showing the altered footage, alongside data from surrounding cameras. At 11:47 p.m., the warehouse camera showed Marcus's red pickup truck parked near the murder scene. But at exactly the same time, 3 other cameras within a 2-block radius showed the same truck driving away from the area. It's physically impossible for the truck to be in both places simultaneously, Wynn said, unless someone replaced the 11:47 timestamp with earlier footage of the truck, probably from when Crawford stopped to urinate behind the building around 11:20. Dr. Kim highlighted the discrepancy with digital markers. They took legitimate footage of him being there earlier and moved it to match the time of the murder. Wynn felt the familiar rush of vindication that came with uncovering the truth. So Marcus was telling the truth. He was there earlier, left, and the killer used his presence to create a false timeline. Not just false, expertly fabricated. This wasn't some random frame job. Someone with serious resources wanted Marcus Crawford convicted for this murder. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. Someone had systematically planned Robert Sterling's murder and Marcus's conviction, using sophisticated digital manipulation to create ironclad evidence of guilt. Dr. Kim, could you trace who did this? Possibly. This level of work leaves digital fingerprints, specific techniques, software signatures, network access patterns. It would take time, but with the right resources. She trailed off, studying Wynn's bruised face. Is it true that your client assaulted you? Wynn touched her cheek self-consciously. It's complicated. I heard he used racial slurs, that he attacked you because of your race. Doctor? Kim, Marcus Crawford is facing execution for a crime he didn't commit. 3 months in jail, abandoned by the system, desperate and afraid. People do terrible things when they're cornered. That doesn't mean he deserves to die for someone else's murder. Dr. Kim was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence on the screens. You know that continuing to represent him after the assault will destroy your credibility with any jury, right? They'll assume you're either incompetent or have some kind of savior complex. Maybe. Or maybe they'll see that the evidence is so compelling that even a lawyer who was attacked by her client believes in his innocence. That's a hell of a gamble with a man's life. Wynn stood up and walked to her office window, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness of Chicago. Somewhere in the city, the real killer was sleeping peacefully, confident that Marcus Crawford would be convicted for his crime. The digital frame job was so sophisticated that it would have fooled anyone who didn't have Wynn's combination of technical knowledge, investigative skills, and stubborn refusal to accept the obvious. Doctor. Kim, I need you to prepare a comprehensive report on this evidence. Timeline analysis, metadata examination, network intrusion patterns, everything that proves the footage was manipulated. For court testimony. For court testimony. Wynn turned back to face the forensics expert. Marcus Crawford may have committed assault, but he's innocent of murder. And if I don't prove that, the real killer gets away with the perfect crime. Dr. Kim nodded slowly. I'll have the report ready in 48 hours, but Wynn, be careful. Someone with this level of technical sophistication and these kinds of resources won't like having their work exposed. They went to enormous trouble to frame Crawford. They won't give up easily. As Dr. Kim packed up her equipment and left. Wynn remained at her window, watching the sun rise over a city that was about to witness something unprecedented. A black lawyer defending the white man who had racially assaulted her, armed with evidence that would expose a conspiracy more sophisticated than anyone imagined. She had no idea how prophetic Dr. Kim's warning would prove to be, but proving Marcus innocent was only the beginning. Judge Paul Washington had seen many unusual situations during his 20-year career on the Cook County bench, but the motion before him was unprecedented. Her public defender was requesting permission to continue representing a client who had committed a racially motivated assault against her just days earlier. "Ms. Chambers," Judge Washington said, peering over his reading glasses at Wynne, who stood before his bench with a barely visible bruise still marking her left cheek. "This court has serious concerns about your continued representation of Mr. Crawford given the recent incident." The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Word of the case had spread through Chicago's legal community like wildfire, the Harvard-trained black lawyer defending her racist attacker. Reporters filled the gallery, along with fellow attorneys, law students, and community activists, drawn by the extraordinary circumstances. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, flanked by 2 bailiffs and looking like a man who had aged a decade in 3 days. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, and his eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights replaying his assault on the woman who was trying to save his life. "Your Honor," Wynne replied, her voice clear and professional, "I understand the court's concerns. However, I have discovered evidence that fundamentally changes this case. Evidence that proves Mr. Crawford's complete innocence of the murder charges." District Attorney Michael Torres rose from the prosecution table. "Your Honor, this is clearly a publicity stunt. Ms. Chambers was the victim of a hate crime committed by her own client. No reasonable attorney would continue representation under these circumstances." "Mr. Torres," Judge Washington said dryly, "in my experience, Ms. Chambers is the most reasonable attorney who appears before this court. If she says she has evidence, this court will hear it." Wynne activated the courtroom's multimedia system, and the large screen behind her displayed a complex timeline analysis. "Your Honor, the state's case against Mr. Crawford relies primarily on security footage that allegedly shows him at the murder scene at the time of death. However, digital forensics analysis reveals that this footage has been systematically falsified." A murmur ran through the courtroom as the timeline appeared, showing the impossible presence of Marcus's truck in multiple locations simultaneously. Dr. Sarah Kim took the witness stand with an air of academic authority. "Your Honor, I hold a PhD in computer science from MIT and have testified in over 50 cases involving digital evidence. The manipulation of this footage represents one of the most sophisticated frame jobs I have ever encountered. For the next hour, Dr. Kim methodically dismantled the prosecution's digital evidence. Timestamp alterations, metadata manipulation, network intrusion patterns. The technical testimony was complex, but the conclusion was devastating. Marcus Crawford had been framed by someone with professional-grade equipment and advanced technical skills. "The level of sophistication suggests this was planned well in advance," Dr. Kim concluded. "Someone with access to multiple camera systems, expensive software, and detailed knowledge of Mr. Crawford's movements orchestrated this frame-up. D.A. Torres attempted cross-examination, but his questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of digital forensics. Dr. Kim, isn't it possible that these discrepancies are just glitches in the system?" "Mr. Torres, these aren't glitches. This is deliberate, systematic manipulation requiring hundreds of hours of work and equipment worth more than most people's homes. Someone invested enormous resources in making sure Marcus Crawford was convicted for this murder." Judge Washington leaned forward, studying the evidence displays. "Ms. Chambers, if this evidence is authentic, why didn't Mr. Crawford's previous attorneys discover it?" "Your Honor, digital forensics analysis of this complexity requires specialized expertise and significant time investment. Mr. Crawford's previous attorneys, through no fault of their own, lacked both the technical knowledge and the resources to conduct this level of investigation." The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. An innocent man had spent 3 months on death row, while the real killer remained free, protected by a frame job so sophisticated that it had fooled everyone until Wynne Chambers refused to accept the obvious. "Mr. Crawford," Judge Washington addressed the defendant directly, Do you understand what your attorney is saying? That you have been framed for murder by someone with considerable technical resources and apparent law enforcement connections. Marcus stood slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I don't understand the technical stuff, but I know I didn't kill Robert Sterling, and I know that Ms. Chambers— He paused, struggling with emotion. I know she's the only person who believed me, even after what I did to her. What you did to her, Mr. Crawford, was commit assault. Possibly a hate crime. How do you explain that? Marcus looked directly at Wynne for the first time since the assault, his eyes filled with shame and regret. There's no explanation, Your Honor, no excuse. I was scared, desperate, and I let my worst impulses take over. I attacked the one person who was trying to help me, and I did it because of her race. It was the worst thing I've ever done, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. The courtroom was dead silent as Marcus continued. But Ms. Chambers never gave up on me even after I hurt her. She found evidence that no one else found, worked nights and weekends to prove my innocence, and she's standing here today asking this court to let her continue saving my life. I don't deserve her help, but I'm grateful for it. Judge Washington studied the evidence, the testimony, and the unprecedented situation before him. After a long moment, he rendered his decision. This court finds the digital forensics evidence compelling and credible. The charges against Mr. Crawford for the murder of Robert Sterling are hereby dismissed. Mr. Crawford is immediately released from custody on the murder charges. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs and scattered applause. However, Judge Washington continued, his voice taking on a stern tone that silenced the courtroom. Mr. Crawford, you still face serious charges for the assault on your attorney. The fact that you were wrongly accused of murder does not excuse your racially motivated attack on Ms. Chambers. The relief that had briefly flickered across Marcus's face disappeared, replaced by the grim recognition that his freedom from death row came with a different kind of justice. He had been saved from execution for a crime he didn't commit, only to face imprisonment for a crime he absolutely did commit. Your Honor, D.A. Torres interjected, clearly struggling to process the dramatic reversal. While the digital evidence regarding the murder is concerning, the assault on Ms. Chambers was witnessed by multiple court officers. The defendant used racial slurs and committed what appears to be a clear hate crime. Judge Washington nodded gravely. The court is well aware of the assault charges, Mr. Torres. The question before us now is how to proceed with a case where justice requires acknowledging both Mr. Crawford's innocence of murder and his guilt of assault. Wynne rose from her seat, and the courtroom held its breath. Everyone expected her to recuse herself from the assault charges. No attorney could reasonably be expected to defend someone who had attacked her, but Wynne Chambers had built her career on doing the unreasonable. Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to address the court regarding the assault charges. Judge Washington raised an eyebrow. Ms. Chambers, you are the victim in the assault case. It would be highly irregular for you to make representations regarding your client's sentencing for attacking you. Your Honor, I am not requesting to serve as Mr. Crawford's attorney for the assault charges. I am requesting permission to make a victim impact statement. The courtroom buzzed with confusion. Victim impact statements typically came after conviction, during sentencing, and usually involved victims asking for harsh punishment. What was Wynne planning? Very well, Miss Chambers. The court will hear your victim impact statement. Wynne walked to the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. As she settled into the chair, the bruise on her cheek caught the courtroom lights, a visible reminder of Marcus's assault. Your Honor, on the afternoon of the assault, I was struck across the face by my client while attempting to present evidence of his innocence. The physical impact was significant. I required medical attention, and as you can see, I still bear the marks of that attack. Marcus slumped further in his chair, unable to look at her. But, Your Honor, the context of that assault cannot be ignored. Mr. Crawford had spent 3 months in county jail, facing execution for a murder he did not commit. He had been failed by 2 previous attorneys who missed crucial evidence. He was looking at death row, while the real killer remained free. D.A. Torres shifted uncomfortably. This was not the victim impact statement anyone had expected. When Mr. Crawford struck me, He was not acting from hatred, but from desperation. He was a drowning man lashing out at the person trying to rescue him because he couldn't see past his own fear and prejudice to recognize salvation when it arrived. Judge Washington leaned forward. "Ms. Chambers, are you asking this court to excuse the assault?" "No, Your Honor. What Mr. Crawford did was inexcusable. He committed assault, and he did so with clear racial motivation. His words and actions that day were reprehensible and caused me significant physical and emotional harm." The courtroom fell silent, confused by the apparent contradiction in her statement. "But, Your Honor, I'm asking this court to consider the extraordinary circumstances that led to that moment. Mr. Crawford was failed by a system that should have protected him. He was facing execution for someone else's crime because investigators and attorneys before me didn't have the resources or expertise to uncover the truth." Wynne paused, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since taking the stand. "Mr. Crawford made a terrible mistake, driven by fear, desperation, and yes, racial prejudice. But in the weeks since that assault, I have had time to consider what justice truly looks like in this situation." "Please continue, Ms. Chambers." "Your Honor, true justice requires acknowledging both the harm Mr. Crawford caused and the harm that was done to him. He struck me in a moment of desperate rage, but he was only in that desperate situation because someone with sophisticated resources and technical expertise deliberately framed him for murder." The courtroom was riveted as Wynne continued. "I do not ask this court to ignore Mr. Crawford's assault. I ask this court to consider that the real villain in this case is still free. Someone who committed murder, framed an innocent man, and created the circumstances that led to violence in that conference room." Judge Washington studied her carefully. "What specifically are you requesting, Ms. Chambers?" "I am requesting that Mr. Crawford be sentenced to community service, specifically working with organizations that combat racial prejudice and support criminal justice reform. I believe that having him share his story, how prejudice nearly cost him his life, and how it led him to attack the person trying to save him, could prevent others from making similar mistakes." The request sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The victim of a racially motivated assault was asking for her attacker to receive rehabilitation rather than imprisonment. D.A. Torres stood up, clearly frustrated. "Your Honor, this is unprecedented. Ms. Chambers was the victim of a hate crime. The state has a duty to prosecute such crimes to the fullest extent of the law." "Mr. Torres," Judge Washington replied, "the state also has a duty to ensure that justice is both fair and constructive. Ms. Chambers has presented compelling evidence that her client was framed for murder by someone still at large. The assault, while inexcusable, occurred in the context of extraordinary circumstances created by that frame-up." Marcus finally looked up, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in months, he saw something he had almost forgotten existed: mercy. "Mr. Crawford," Judge Washington addressed him directly, "do you accept responsibility for assaulting Ms. Chambers?" Marcus stood slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Your Honor, completely. I attacked Ms. Chambers because of her race, and there is no excuse for that. She was trying to save my life, and I repaid her kindness with violence and hatred." "And how do you respond to her recommendation for community service rather than imprisonment?" "Your Honor, I don't deserve her mercy. But if given the chance, I want to spend the rest of my life making sure that other people don't make the same terrible mistakes I made. I want to tell everyone who will listen that prejudice nearly cost me everything: my freedom, my life, and my humanity." Judge Washington nodded slowly. "This court finds Mr. Crawford guilty of assault and acknowledges the racial motivation behind that assault. However, given the extraordinary circumstances revealed in this case and the compelling victim impact statement, this court sentences Mr. Crawford to 2 years of supervised community service, specifically focused on racial reconciliation and criminal justice reform." The gavel fell, and with it, the most unusual case in Cook County history reached its resolution. Marcus Crawford walked free from murder charges while accepting responsibility for assault. Wynne Chambers had not only saved the life of the man who attacked her, but had transformed his punishment into an opportunity for redemption. But as the courtroom began to empty, both Wynne and Marcus knew their story was far from over. What happened next would shock the entire courthouse. Stories of forgiveness and justice inspire people all around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages of second chances are reaching. The media explosion was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of Judge Washington's ruling, news vans lined the streets outside the Cook County Courthouse. The story had everything that modern media craved: racial tension, legal drama, moral complexity, and an ending that defied easy categorization. Harvard-trained black lawyer saves racist white client who assaulted her. The headlines wrote themselves, but they couldn't capture the nuanced reality of what had actually transpired in that courtroom. Wynne stood at her office window, watching reporters interview random pedestrians about their opinions on the case. Her phone had been ringing non-stop. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, local stations, podcasts, and documentary filmmakers all wanted exclusive interviews with the lawyer who had redefined the meaning of professional dedication. Her supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, knocked and entered without waiting for permission, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of bewildered admiration. "Wynne, I owe you an apology," Janet said, setting down the coffee and taking a seat. "When you insisted on continuing Marcus's representation after the assault, I thought you had lost your mind. I was wrong." Wynne turned from the window, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You weren't wrong to be concerned, Janet. What I did was risky, unprecedented, and could have backfired spectacularly. But it didn't. You not only proved an innocent man's innocence, you found a way to address his assault without destroying the possibility of redemption. The legal community is calling it masterful." "The legal community loves a good story," Wynne replied with a tired smile. "But this was never about creating a masterful legal strategy. It was about doing what was right, even when it was complicated." Janet leaned forward. "Walk me through it, Wynne. How did you maintain objectivity about a client who committed a hate crime against you?" "Because I'm having trouble understanding how you separated your personal feelings from your professional obligations." Wynne sat down across from her supervisor, considering the question carefully. "I won't pretend it was easy, Janet. When Marcus hit me, my first instinct was to walk away and let him face the consequences of his actions. The assault hurt, physically, emotionally, and professionally. But you didn't walk away." "No, I didn't. Because as I sat in that emergency room getting my cheek examined, I realized something crucial. Marcus's assault didn't change the fact that he was innocent of murder. His prejudice, his violence, his terrible judgment, none of that made him guilty of killing Robert Sterling." Janet shook her head. "Most people would have said that his character flaws made him more likely to be guilty. Most people would have been wrong. Character flaws don't create digital evidence, Janet. Someone with sophisticated technical skills and expensive equipment framed Marcus for murder. That someone is still out there, probably assuming they got away with the perfect crime." The phone rang again, the 15th time in the past hour. Wynne let it go to voicemail. "There's something else," Wynne continued. "Marcus's assault forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about the system we work in. He was failed by 2 previous attorneys who didn't have the resources or expertise to properly investigate his case. He spent 3 months facing execution because the system assumed his guilt and worked backward from there." "So you're saying the system created the circumstances that led to the assault?" "I'm saying the system's failures don't excuse Marcus's actions, but they provide context for understanding how a desperate, frightened man could lash out at the person trying to help him." Wynne sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Marcus made terrible choices, but he made them while drowning in a system that had already written him off. Janet was quiet for a moment, processing the complexity of the situation. "The media is portraying you as either a saint or a fool, depending on the outlet. How do you respond to that?" "I don't," Wynne said simply. "I'm neither a saint nor a fool. I'm a lawyer who uncovered evidence of innocence and chose to act on it despite personal complications. That's what we're supposed to do." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Wynne's assistant entered, looking slightly overwhelmed. "Ms. Chambers, there's someone here to see you. Marcus Crawford is in the lobby with his family. They're asking if you have a few minutes to speak with them." Wynne and Janet exchanged glances. This was the first time Marcus had contacted her, since the sentencing 2 days earlier. Part of her was curious about what he wanted to say. Another part of her wondered if she was ready for that conversation. "Send them up," Wynne decided. "Janet, you're welcome to stay if you'd like." 5 minutes later, Marcus Crawford stood in her office doorway, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he had in the courtroom. He was accompanied by a middle-aged woman with worried eyes and a teenage boy who kept staring at Wynne with undisguised awe. "Ms. Chambers," Marcus began, his voice hesitant, "I know you don't owe me anything, but I was hoping we could talk. This is my wife, Susan, and my son, Tyler." Wynne gestured to the chairs in front of her desk. "Please, sit. How can I help you?" Susan Crawford leaned forward, tears already forming in her eyes. "Miss Chambers, I need to thank you for saving my husband's life. But more than that, I need to apologize for the man he was when he attacked you." "Mrs. Crawford, you don't need to apologize for your husband's actions." "Yes, I do," Susan insisted. "Because I knew he carried those prejudices. I heard the things he said about black people, the assumptions he made, the jokes he thought were harmless. I should have challenged him. I should have made him confront his racism before it led to something like this." Tyler, the teenage son, finally spoke up. "Ms. Chambers, my dad was wrong about everything. About you, about black people, about the system. He almost died because he couldn't see past his own prejudice to recognize that you were the only person who could save him." Marcus hadn't spoken since the introductions, but now he cleared his throat. "Ms. Chambers, I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 2 days. How do you apologize to someone who saved your life after you assaulted them for trying to help?" "You don't apologize to me, Marcus," Wynne replied gently. "You apologize to yourself for nearly destroying your life with hatred, and then you spend every day making sure you never make those mistakes again." "That's what I want to talk to you about," Marcus said, leaning forward. "Judge Washington sentenced me to community service focused on racial reconciliation. I want to do more than just fulfill the requirements. I want to understand how my prejudice nearly cost me everything, and I want to help other people avoid making the same mistakes." Wynne studied him carefully, looking for signs of genuine transformation versus performative remorse. What she saw was a man genuinely grappling with the consequences of his beliefs. "What specifically are you proposing, Marcus?" "I want to work with organizations that bring people together across racial lines. I want to speak at schools, churches, community centers, anywhere people will listen. I want to tell my story, how racial prejudice nearly got me executed, and how it led me to attack the black woman who saved my life." Susan nodded encouragingly. "We've already reached out to several organizations. They're interested in having Marcus share his experience, especially the part about how assumptions and stereotypes can blind us to the people who are actually trying to help." Tyler added, "Dad's story could help other white people understand how their prejudices hurt everyone, including themselves. He's living proof that racism isn't just morally wrong, it's practically stupid." Wynne couldn't help but smile at the teenager's blunt assessment. "Marcus, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I need to know that this comes from genuine transformation, not just guilt or publicity." Marcus met her eyes directly. "Miss Chambers, 3 months ago I was convinced that the system was rigged against people like me. I thought black people in positions of authority were diversity hires who couldn't understand or help regular white folks. I was so wrong that my wrongness nearly killed me." He paused, struggling with emotion. "How you saved my life twice, once by proving my innocence and once by showing mercy when I deserved punishment. I can never repay that debt, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure other people don't make the same terrible mistakes I made." The office fell silent as everyone processed the weight of Marcus's words. Finally, Wynne spoke. "Marcus, if you're serious about this work, I know several organizations that could use your perspective, but I need you to understand something. This isn't about redemption through good deeds. This is about fundamentally changing how you see the world and other people." "I understand," Marcus replied, "and I'm ready to do the work." As the Crawford family prepared to leave, Tyler turned back to Wynne with teenage directness. "Ms. Chambers, can I ask you something? Why did you save my dad after what he did to you?" Wynne considered the question carefully. "Because everyone deserves justice, Tyler. even people who make terrible mistakes driven by fear and prejudice. Your father was innocent of murder, and that innocence didn't disappear because of his other failings. But wasn't it hard, helping someone who hurt you? It was one of the hardest things I've ever done professionally, Wynne admitted. But it was also one of the most important. Because justice isn't just about punishing bad behavior, it's about creating a system where truth matters more than prejudice. As the family left, Janet looked at Wynne with newfound respect. You know what you've done, don't you? You've created a blueprint for how the justice system could work if we focused on truth and rehabilitation rather than punishment and revenge. Wynne returned to her window, watching the Crawford family navigate through the crowd of reporters outside. In a few months, Marcus would begin his community service, sharing his story and hopefully preventing others from making similar mistakes. But the most incredible transformation was yet to come. 6 months after Judge Washington's landmark ruling, the ripple effects of the Crawford case were being felt throughout the American legal system. Law schools were adding the case to their curricula as an example of ethical complexity in legal representation. Bar associations were hosting seminars on maintaining professional obligations in the face of client misconduct. And criminal justice reform advocates were pointing to the case as evidence of the need for better resources in public defense. Wynne sat in the conference room of the American Bar Association's headquarters in Washington, D.C. I'm surrounded by some of the most prominent legal minds in the country. She had been invited to speak at a special symposium on professional ethics in extreme circumstances, but the conversation had evolved into something much broader. Ms. Chambers, said Professor Elizabeth Harper from Yale Law School, your handling of the Crawford case has forced the legal community to reconsider fundamental assumptions about attorney-client relationships. How do you respond to critics who argue that you set a dangerous precedent by continuing to represent a client who assaulted you? Wynne adjusted the microphone in front of her, looking out at the audience of law professors, judges, and practicing attorneys. Professor Harper, I understand the concerns about precedent, but I would argue that the more dangerous precedent would have been abandoning a client based on personal animus rather than legal merit. Judge Margaret Chen from the Second Circuit leaned forward. But surely there must be limits to professional obligation. If attorneys are expected to represent clients who physically assault them, we're essentially asking lawyers to accept victimization as part of their job. With respect, Judge Chen, I don't think that's the lesson of the Crawford case, Wynne replied. The lesson is that our professional obligations require us to separate personal grievances from legal merit. Marcus Crawford assaulted me, and he faced consequences for that assault. But his guilt regarding the assault didn't change his innocence regarding the murder. Dean Robert Sullivan from Stanford Law interjected, Ms. Chambers, the technical aspects of your case were extraordinary. The digital forensics, the sophisticated frame-up, but most public defenders don't have access to those resources. Are we creating unrealistic expectations for what constitutes adequate representation? Wynne nodded, appreciating the question. Dean Sullivan, you've identified one of the most important systemic issues revealed by this case. I was only able to uncover the digital manipulation because I had personal relationships with forensics experts and was willing to work unpaid overtime for weeks. Most public defenders are handling impossible caseloads without those resources. She stood up, moving to the presentation screen behind her. The Crawford case isn't just about one wrongful conviction or one assault. It's about a system that underfunds public defense to such an extent that innocent people routinely plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit because their attorneys don't have the time or resources to properly investigate. The screen displayed statistics that made several audience members shift uncomfortably. Average caseloads for public defenders, funding disparities between prosecution and defense, and wrongful conviction rates in cases where defendants couldn't afford private attorneys. The real lesson of the Crawford case, Wynne continued, is that we need systemic reform. Better funding for public defense, mandatory continuing education in digital forensics, and investigation resources that allow attorneys to properly serve their clients. Professor Harper raised her hand. But Ms. Chambers, Even with better resources, how do we address the personal dimension of your case, the racial aspect of the assault, the emotional toll of representing someone who harmed you? Wynne paused, considering how to address what had been the most personally challenging aspect of the entire experience. Professor Harper, I won't pretend that representing Marcus after his assault was easy. It required me to separate my personal feelings from my professional responsibilities in ways that tested every principle I hold dear. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of herself and Marcus at a community reconciliation event the previous month. But it also taught me something crucial about justice. Sometimes the most important work we do as attorneys is the work that makes us uncomfortable. Marcus's transformation from a racist who assaulted his attorney to an advocate for racial reconciliation didn't happen despite the legal system. It happened because the legal system created space for both accountability and redemption. Judge Chen nodded thoughtfully. You're arguing that justice requires both punishment and rehabilitation. I'm arguing that justice requires truth, accountability, and the possibility of transformation. Marcus was held accountable for his assault through his conviction and community service, but he was also given the opportunity to transform his understanding of race, justice, and his own prejudices. Dean Sullivan leaned back in his chair. Ms. Chambers, there are critics who argue that you received too much credit for simply doing your job, that uncovering evidence of innocence is what defense attorneys are supposed to do. Wynne smiled wryly. Dean Sullivan, those critics are absolutely right. Uncovering evidence of innocence is exactly what defense attorneys are supposed to do. The fact that it's considered newsworthy reveals how rarely we actually have the resources and support to do our jobs properly. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. She was simultaneously accepting credit for exceptional work while indicting a system that made such work exceptional rather than routine. Professor Harper spoke into the silence. So, what's the solution, Ms. Chambers? How do we systemically address these issues? Wynne advanced to her final slide, which outlined a comprehensive reform proposal. First, we need adequate funding for public defense, not just enough money to process cases, but enough to properly investigate them. Second, we need mandatory training in digital forensics and other modern investigative techniques. Third, we need to address the racial and socioeconomic biases that make cases like Marcus's possible in the first place. And fourth, she continued, we need to recognize that justice isn't just about determining guilt or innocence. It's about creating a system where truth can emerge, where mistakes can be corrected, and where people have the opportunity to grow beyond their worst moments. Judge Chen raised a final question. Ms. Chambers, 6 months later, do you have any regrets about your handling of the Crawford case? Wynne considered the question carefully, thinking about the media attention, the professional challenges, and the ongoing complexity of her relationship with Marcus and his family. Judge Chen, I regret that Marcus felt desperate enough to assault me. I regret that he spent 3 months facing execution for someone else's crime. And I regret that it took extraordinary circumstances to reveal the systemic problems that allow innocent people to be wrongfully convicted. She paused, looking out at the audience of legal professionals. But I don't regret proving his innocence, and I don't regret creating space for his transformation. Because at the end of the day, that's what the justice system should do. Reveal truth, assign appropriate consequences, and create opportunities for people to become better than they were. As the symposium concluded, Wynne was approached by dozens of attorneys, professors, and students wanting to discuss the case further. But the conversation that stayed with her was with a young black law student from Howard University. Ms. Chambers, the student said, I want to be a public defender because of how you handled the Crawford case. You showed that we can fight for justice even when it's complicated, even when it's personal, even when the client doesn't deserve our help. Wynne smiled, remembering her own idealism as a young law student. What's your name? Keisha Washington, ma'am. I'm graduating next month. Keisha, the most important thing I learned from the Crawford case is that justice isn't about whether someone deserves our help. It's about whether the system works fairly for everyone, including people who make terrible mistakes. If you become a public defender with that understanding, you'll make a real difference. As Wynne left the symposium and headed to the airport, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrible afternoon in the county jail conference room. A case that had begun with violence and hatred had evolved into a model for systemic reform and personal transformation. But the most surprising development was still to come. The judge's decision would set a precedent for the entire system. 1 year after the assault that had changed both their lives, Wynne Chambers and Marcus Crawford stood together on the stage of Northwestern University's Law School auditorium, preparing to deliver a joint presentation to over 400 students, faculty, and legal professionals. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating in adjoining rooms showing the presentation via live feed. The transformation in Marcus was remarkable. The angry, desperate man who had lashed out in racial hatred had become a thoughtful advocate for criminal justice reform. He had completed his community service requirements 6 months early, but had continued working with racial reconciliation organizations as a volunteer. More importantly, he had enrolled in paralegal classes and was now working part-time with the Cook County Public Defender's Office, the same office where he had assaulted his attorney. "Ladies and gentlemen," the dean announced, "please welcome Wynne Chambers, Senior Supervisor of the Cook County Public Defender's Office, and Marcus Crawford, Criminal Justice Reform Advocate and paralegal student." The applause was warm but uncertain. The audience knew the story, but seeing the victim and perpetrator of a racially motivated assault standing together as colleagues was still jarring for many. Wynne began their presentation. 15 months ago, Mr. Crawford and I met under circumstances that neither of us would wish on anyone. I was a public defender assigned to represent him on murder charges. He was a man facing execution for a crime he didn't commit, abandoned by a system that should have protected him. Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady but carrying the weight of lived experience. 15 months ago, I was so consumed by fear, desperation, and racial prejudice that I committed assault against the only person who could save my life. I looked at Ms. Chambers and saw not a Harvard-trained attorney with the skills to prove my innocence, but a black woman who I assumed couldn't understand or help someone like me. The auditorium was completely silent. Even the students who thought they were prepared for this presentation found themselves confronted with the raw honesty of Marcus's admission. The irony, Wynne continued, was that while Marcus was rejecting my help based on racial assumptions, someone else was counting on those same assumptions to ensure his conviction. The person who framed Marcus for murder understood that a jury would be more likely to convict a working-class white man with a criminal record than to look deeply at digital evidence. Marcus nodded. The real killer used my prejudices against me. They knew that my distrust of the system, my racial resentments, and my desperation would make me the perfect patsy. They were almost right. A student in the front row raised her hand. "Mr. Crawford, how do you reconcile representing the system that you attacked? Aren't you concerned about your credibility given your assault conviction?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "That's exactly why my work has credibility. I'm not some academic or activist who studies these problems from the outside. I'm someone who lived through the worst possible failures of the system and came out the other side with a deep understanding of how prejudice and systemic inadequacy combine to create injustice." Wynne added, "Marcus's perspective is invaluable because he understands both sides of the equation. He knows what it feels like to be failed by the system, and he knows how prejudice can blind us to the people who are actually trying to help." A law professor in the middle section stood up. "Ms. Chambers, critics have argued that your forgiveness of Mr. Crawford sends the wrong message about hate crimes. How do you respond to concerns that you've essentially excused racially motivated violence?" "Professor, I think that criticism misunderstands what actually happened," Wynne replied. "Marcus wasn't excused or forgiven in the sense of facing no consequences. He was convicted of assault, sentenced to community service, and has spent the past year doing intensive work on understanding and combating his own prejudices." Marcus stepped closer to the microphone. "If I may add to that, forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the assault didn't happen or that it wasn't serious. It means creating space for transformation while still holding people accountable for their actions." He paused, looking out at the audience. I face the consequences of my assault every day. I have a hate crime conviction on my record. I lost friends, job opportunities, and the respect of my community. But Ms. Chambers' approach to justice gave me something more valuable than punishment. The opportunity to understand why I acted the way I did, and to spend my life making sure others don't make the same mistakes. A student near the back called out, "What about the real killer? Was anyone ever caught?" Wynne and Marcus exchanged glances. This was the part of the story they rarely discussed publicly. The digital forensics evidence pointed to someone with sophisticated technical skills and possible law enforcement connections, Wynne explained. The investigation is ongoing, but prosecuting digital crimes of this complexity is extremely challenging. Marcus added grimly, "Whoever framed me is still out there." They committed murder, manipulated evidence, and nearly succeeded in having an innocent man executed. The only reason their plan failed was because Ms. Chambers had the expertise and dedication to uncover their work. Another student asked, "Mr. Crawford, do you ever regret not taking a plea deal? You could have avoided the assault entirely." "Every day," Marcus replied immediately, "if I had trusted Ms. Chambers from the beginning, if I had been able to see past my prejudices to recognize her competence, I never would have assaulted her. But I also realize that my journey, as painful as it's been, has given me insights that I couldn't have gained any other way." Wynne nodded. Marcus's question raises an important point about systemic reform. How many other innocent defendants accept plea deals because they don't trust their attorneys, or because the system doesn't provide adequate resources for investigation? Marcus was lucky. He had an attorney willing to work unpaid overtime and access to forensics experts. Most defendants don't have those advantages. The presentation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from implicit bias in the legal system to the need for better funding for public defense. But the most powerful moments came when Marcus and Wynne discussed their ongoing working relationship. "People often ask how we can work together after what happened," Wynne explained. "The answer is that we're both committed to preventing other people from experiencing what we went through. Marcus brings the perspective of someone who was failed by the system, and I bring the technical expertise to identify and address those failures." Marcus smiled, something that would have been impossible during their first meeting. "Ms. Chambers saved my life twice, once by proving my innocence and once by showing me that transformation is possible, even after you've done something terrible. Now we're working together to save other people's lives by fixing the system that nearly destroyed both of us." As the presentation concluded, the audience gave them a standing ovation. During the reception afterward, they were approached by students, attorneys, and activists interested in their reform proposals. But the conversation that meant the most to both of them was with a young white law student who looked nervous as he approached. "Mr. Crawford," the student said hesitantly, "I grew up in a family with a lot of racial prejudice. Hearing your story makes me realize how those attitudes could affect my work as a lawyer. Do you have any advice?" Marcus looked at the young man with compassion and understanding. "The first step is recognizing that you have those prejudices. Most people never get that far. The second step is understanding that overcoming them isn't about feeling guilty or pretending they don't exist. It's about doing the hard work of examining why you think the way you do, and making conscious choices to act differently." Wynne added, "And remember that fighting prejudice isn't just about becoming a better person, though that's important. It's about becoming a more effective lawyer." My ability to represent Marcus well had nothing to do with his race or mine. It had to do with my skills, preparation, and commitment to uncovering the truth. As they left the university that evening, Marcus turned to Wynne. "A year ago, I never could have imagined we'd be doing presentations together." "A year ago," Wynne replied, "I never could have imagined that my most challenging case would turn into my most important partnership." Their collaboration was about to inspire something unprecedented in the American legal system. The final chapter of this story would inspire thousands. 2 years after the assault that had brought them together in the most unlikely way possible, Wynne Chambers and Marcus Crawford stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, surrounded by criminal justice reform advocates, legal professionals, and government officials. They were there for the signing of the Crawford-Chambers Act, federal legislation that would provide funding for digital forensics training in public defender offices nationwide and establish standards for investigating claims of evidence manipulation. The transformation of their story from a moment of violence to a symbol of systemic reform had been extraordinary. Their joint presentations had inspired similar partnerships across the country, attorneys and former clients working together to address the failures that had brought them together. Law schools had established Crawford Chambers fellowships for students committed to criminal justice reform. Bar associations had created continuing education requirements based on their work, and the Department of Justice had launched a pilot program to review cases involving sophisticated digital evidence manipulation. What had begun as a personal crisis had evolved into a national movement for criminal justice reform. President Sarah Martinez approached the podium, flanked by Wynne and Marcus. The symbolism was powerful. A black woman attorney and a white former defendant who had assaulted her, now standing together as champions of justice reform. 2 years ago, President Martinez began, a moment of violence in a Chicago courthouse conference room could have been just another tragic example of how prejudice destroys lives. Instead, it became the catalyst for one of the most important pieces of criminal justice legislation in decades. She gestured toward Wynne and Marcus. The Crawford Chambers Act represents what's possible when we choose transformation over retribution, when we choose systemic solutions over individual blame, and when we choose to learn from our failures rather than simply punish them. The legislation was comprehensive. $500 million in federal funding for digital forensics training in public defender offices, mandatory continuing education requirements for attorneys handling cases involving digital evidence, and the establishment of a national database for tracking evidence manipulation in criminal cases. But beyond the policy details, the law represented something more significant, a recognition that the criminal justice system could evolve, that individual transformation was possible even in the aftermath of terrible mistakes, and that the most unlikely partnerships could produce the most powerful changes. As President Martinez signed the bill, Wynne reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The sting of Marcus's slap had faded long ago, but the lessons learned from that afternoon continued to shape both their lives and the broader legal system. After the ceremony, they found themselves in a quiet corner of the White House reception, surrounded by lawmakers and activists, but taking a moment to process the magnitude of what had just happened. "Wynne," Marcus said quietly, "do you ever think about what would have happened if I had trusted you from the beginning? If I had been able to see past my prejudices to recognize that you were trying to save my life?" Wynne considered the question, sipping her champagne and watching the celebration around them. "Marcus, I used to think about that a lot. How different things might have been if you had accepted my help, without the violence, without the assault, without the pain we both went through." She paused, watching a group of young attorneys from across the country who had traveled to witness the signing. "But I've come to realize that our story has power precisely because it includes the worst-case scenario. It shows that transformation is possible even after someone has done something unforgivable. That's a message people need to hear." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The assault was the worst thing I ever did, but the work that came after it has been the most meaningful thing I've ever done. I spend every day trying to make sure other people don't make the same terrible mistakes I made." "And you're succeeding," Wynne replied. "Do you know that the reconciliation program you developed in Chicago has been adopted by 12 other cities? That over 300 attorneys have completed the bias training curriculum you helped design?" A young black law student approached them nervously, holding a program from the ceremony. "Excuse me, Ms. Chambers, Mr. Crawford. I'm Jessica Williams, a third-year student at Howard Law School. I wrote my thesis on the Crawford case, and I just wanted to thank you for showing that justice can be complicated and still be right." Marcus smiled warmly. "Jessica, what aspect of the case did your thesis focus on?" "I studied how personal transformation can become systemic reform," she replied. "Your individual journey from perpetrator to advocate helped create policies that will protect thousands of defendants who might otherwise be wrongfully convicted." Wynne was struck by the student's insight. "Jessica, that's exactly right. Individual change and systemic change aren't separate processes, they're connected. Marcus's personal growth informed our policy recommendations, and our policy work has created opportunities for other people to experience similar transformations. The student's eyes lit up with understanding. So the Crawford-Chambers Act isn't just about preventing wrongful convictions, it's about creating a system that allows for both accountability and redemption? Exactly, Marcus replied. The law provides resources for better investigations, so innocent people don't get convicted. But it also creates opportunities for people who make mistakes, attorneys, defendants, even perpetrators like me, to learn from those mistakes and contribute to solutions. As the reception continued, Wynne and Marcus were approached by dozens of people whose lives had been touched by their story. Public defenders who had received digital forensics training funded by early pilot programs. Former defendants who had been inspired by Marcus's transformation to pursue their own education and advocacy work. Attorneys who had taken on difficult cases because they had seen what was possible when lawyers truly committed to uncovering the truth. But the conversation that moved them most deeply was with Robert Sterling's widow, Margaret, who had traveled from Seattle for the ceremony. "Ms. Chambers, Mr. Crawford," she said, approaching them with visible emotion, "I wanted to thank you for what you've done." Marcus looked stricken. "Mrs. Sterling, I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you. Your husband's real killer is still—" Margaret held up her hand gently. "Mr. Crawford, I know you didn't kill my husband. I've followed your case closely, and I understand that you were framed by whoever did kill Robert. But that's not why I'm here." She looked between them with tears in her eyes. "I'm here because your story has given meaning to Robert's death. The Crawford-Chambers Act will prevent other families from going through what mine did, having a loved one's killer go free while an innocent person faces execution. Your transformation, your partnership, your advocacy, it's all part of Robert's legacy now." The moment was profound in its implications. The victim's family had found healing not in revenge or punishment, but in the systemic changes that would prevent similar tragedies. It was justice in its highest form, transforming individual pain into collective protection. As the White House reception wound down, Wynne and Marcus found themselves outside on the South Lawn, looking back at the building where history had just been made. "2 years ago, I thought my career might be over," Wynne admitted. "I had been assaulted by a client, faced criticism for continuing his representation, and was dealing with media attention that I never wanted. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over," Marcus replied. "I was facing execution for someone else's crime, and I had just committed assault against the only person who could save me." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the journey from that terrible afternoon in the county jail to this moment of national recognition. "Wynne," Marcus said finally, "I need to ask you something I've never asked before. Do you forgive me for what I did to you?" Wynne turned to face him directly. "Marcus, I forgave you a long time ago. Not because you deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to anger would have prevented me from doing the work that needed to be done. But do you think other people can learn from our story? Can other victims find a way to transform their pain into something constructive?" "I think," Wynne said carefully, "that our story shows what's possible when people are willing to do the hard work of transformation. Not everyone will make the same choices we made, and that's okay. But our example proves that even the worst situations can become opportunities for growth and systemic change." Marcus nodded. "The paralegal program I'm in graduates me next month. I've been accepted to law school for next fall." Wynne smiled. "Marcus, that's wonderful. Where will you be going?" "Northwestern. I want to specialize in criminal defense, specifically representing people who have been failed by the system the way I was." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The man who had once attacked his defense attorney was now preparing to become a defense attorney himself, committed to providing the kind of representation he had initially rejected. "There's something poetic about that," Wynne observed. "You're going to become what you once couldn't recognize or trust." "I'm going to become what I needed when I was at my lowest point," Marcus corrected. "Someone who understands both sides of the system, how it can fail people, and how people can overcome those failures to create something better." As they walked toward the White House gates, preparing to return to their respective flights back to Chicago, Marcus stopped suddenly. Wynne, do you ever wonder if whoever really killed Robert Sterling is watching our story? If they see what their crime ultimately led to? Wynne considered the question. The real killer had never been found, despite ongoing FBI investigations. The sophisticated nature of the digital manipulation suggested someone with professional training and expensive equipment, but the trail had gone cold. "I hope they are watching," she said finally. "I hope they see that their attempt to destroy your life ultimately led to reforms that will make it much harder for future killers to frame innocent people. I hope they understand that their crime didn't just fail. It backfired spectacularly." Marcus smiled grimly. "They tried to use my prejudices to ensure my conviction. Instead, overcoming those prejudices became the foundation for everything we've accomplished." "That's the real justice in this story," Wynne agreed. "Not just that you were cleared of murder charges, but that your transformation helped create a system where fewer innocent people will face what you faced." As they reached the gate, Wynne's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. "What is it?" Marcus asked. "It's from Jessica Williams, the Howard Law student we met earlier. She just got accepted to the Crawford Chambers Fellowship Program at Northwestern. She'll be starting as a research assistant next fall, working on digital forensics training for public defenders." Marcus grinned. "So our story is inspiring the next generation of attorneys?" "Our story is creating the next generation of attorneys," Wynne corrected. "Lawyers who understand that justice requires both individual transformation and systemic reform. Attorneys who won't give up on difficult clients or complicated cases. Advocates who know that the most important work is often the most uncomfortable work." They paused at the security checkpoint, preparing to part ways for the first time in months. Their partnership had become so natural, so productive, that it was easy to forget how it had begun. "Marcus," Wynne said, "I want you to know that working with you these past 2 years has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. Not despite what happened in that conference room, but because of everything that came after it." "Wynne," Marcus replied, "you saved my life in every way that matters. You proved my innocence, yes, but more importantly, you showed me that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us, and that the most unlikely partnerships can create the most powerful changes." They shook hands formally, as they had at the end of their first meeting 2 years earlier. But this handshake was different. It was between colleagues, collaborators, and friends who had transformed individual trauma into collective progress. If these stories inspire people all around the world to believe in the power of transformation, please let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these messages of redemption and justice are reaching. As Wynne boarded her flight back to Chicago, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. A moment of racist violence had become a catalyst for criminal justice reform. A personal assault had been transformed into a professional partnership. A story of hatred had evolved into a testament to the possibility of redemption. The Crawford Chambers Act would prevent wrongful convictions, but its deeper legacy was the proof that even the worst moments in human interaction could become opportunities for growth, understanding, and systemic change. Marcus, settling into his seat on a different flight, pulled out his law school preparation materials. In 18 months he would graduate and begin practicing criminal defense law. His first clients would likely be people who, like his former self, had given up hope in the system and couldn't recognize salvation when it appeared. But unlike his own first meeting with Wynne, Marcus would be prepared for that skepticism, that fear, that misdirected anger. He would know how to see past prejudice to the person underneath, how to maintain professional composure in the face of personal attack, and how to transform individual cases into opportunities for broader reform. The plane lifted off, carrying both of them back to Chicago, where their story had begun and where their work would continue. Tomorrow, Wynne would return to her office at the Cook County Public Defender's Office, now equipped with state-of-the-art digital forensics equipment funded by the Crawford Chambers Act. Marcus would return to his paralegal studies and his advocacy work, preparing for a legal career that had seemed impossible during his darkest hours. Their story had become legend in legal circles, the black defense attorney and the white client who had assaulted her, transforming personal trauma into systemic change. Law students would study their case for decades, learning not just about criminal procedure and evidence law, but about the possibility of redemption, the complexity of justice, and the power of unlikely partnerships to create profound change. But perhaps the most important lesson of their story was simpler and more universal. That people can change, that transformation is possible even after terrible mistakes, and that the most meaningful justice comes not from punishment alone, but from creating opportunities for both accountability and redemption. The Crawford case had ended with both personal transformation and systemic reform. Marcus had faced consequences for his assault while being given opportunities to grow beyond his prejudices. Wynne had maintained her professional ethics while expanding her understanding of what justice could look like. And the legal system had gained new tools and perspectives that would protect future defendants while honoring the victims of both wrongful accusations and actual crimes. It was justice in its most complete form: complex, uncomfortable, transformative, and ultimately redemptive. Thank you to everyone who typed redeem and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.